Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. I personally prefer to make my own piping because it allows me to use the seam allowance that I am most comfortable with, which is 5/8 of an inch, because most of the patterns that I work with have that as their standard seam allowance. You can use this method to make your piping with any seam allowance that you want to add to it, depending on the project that you are doing. I know seam allowances vary across different patterns and pattern companies. I prefer my piping to have the exact same seam allowance as the pattern I'm working with because I find it easier to maintain the stitching line if both the raw edge of the pattern piece and the piping match up. So this is how I make my piping. I have some different options here for making your own piping. Obviously you can buy pre-made piping. I tend to find that the flange on that isn't always a consistent seam allowance that I want to work with, and also it's a restriction on fabric type and colour. So I like to make my own because I can get exactly what I want by doing that. So there are different options for the innards of your piping, and I've got 3 here to show you, but there are more. So the first one is some actual piping cord. Very lovely Deb sent me this, and this is actually a little thick for the piping that I want to use on the dress that I'm going to be making, but it is technically officially piping cord. Then I've got some macrame cord here, which was sent to me by the very lovely Caroline, and this is slightly narrower than this one. Obviously you can buy piping cording in lots of different diameters. This just happened to be the one that Deb sent me, and it's going to be perfect for bag making, and I will use it for that, but it is just a little bit too chunky for my preference for the dress that I'm going to be making. So the macrame cord is a little bit skinnier but the same kind of twisted cord. And then the final one that I've got here, which is the one that I use most often and the one that I'm actually going to use today, is some cotton string. So I have used this in at least 4 different projects that have been washed and worn multiple times, and I've had no issues with using this string for my piping stuffing, as it were. It is cotton string and it's not coloured in any way. You don't want to end up with a blue soup situation. Anyone who hasn't seen Bridget Jones's Diary will think I'm totally crazy, but yeah, no blue soup situations in this one. It's washed and worn really well in the dresses that I've used it in, and it is the narrowest of the 3 that I have here for you. But I did want to show you different options that you can use. You can also use wool. I've never tried that, and I personally might find that a little bit too squishy to give me the kind of resistance that I like for my piping. There's definitely kind of like some heft to it. I feel like wool is very spongy, so it might not work as well for the way that I like to use piping. Something else you can do is just do flat piping with no stuffing in it whatsoever, which is something that I've done a couple of times on the Carolyn PJs and also the linings of lots of the coats that I do, because I really like how it looks. But I do find flat piping for a project like this one, which has got lots of twists and turns and bends and corners, can be a little bit problematic to keep and maintain a even amount of piping around all those twists and turns and corners and things, which is again why I like to use a stuffing. So I'm going to go for the cotton string. So I have some kind of viscose, possibly a viscose linen blend fabric here that the very lovely Suki Samantha sent me, and I've got 1.05 meters, so 105 centimeters of the full width of this fabric. Something you want to take into account when you are making piping is the seam allowance that you're working with. I'm working with a Vogue pattern which has a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's just pretty much standard for most of the patterns that I work with. But if you are working with an indie pattern or a self-drafted pattern, you want to take into account the amount of seam allowance that you've allowed yourself for your pattern. So the first thing that you want to do is double your seam allowance, so the 5/8 of an inch becomes 1¼ inches, and then you need to take into account the amount of room that your piping cord, your chosen cord, whether it be the cotton string or actual piping cord, is going to take up. I've got a really narrow string here, and this is, as I say, one that I particularly like. Once I have wrapped my fabric strip around the cord, I need to take into account the amount of fabric that goes around the piping stuffing. So for me, for this string, I actually cut my strips at 1.5 inches. So it goes from 1.25, which is double the seam allowance that I'm working with. 5/8 of an inch doubled is 1 inch and 1/4, and then that extra 1/4 of an inch allows for wrapping of the piping stuffing nice and snugly, and will still give me a flange that's 5/8 of an inch wide. I'm going to cut a little bit off just of the corner just to show you. So the other thing that we want to do when we're making piping, or at least that I like to do when I'm making piping, is to cut this on the bias, and I need a lot of piping for the project that I'm doing. So I'm going to chop off the smallest amount of this corner to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, because I'm going to need as much of the length of this as I can possibly get. I also would highly suggest that you iron this. This is again just a sample, so before you cut into yours, please make sure that you iron it. Now you can use a ruler and a rotary cutter if that is your preference. I do not get on well with rulers and rotary cutters. You can see here a really good illustration of why you should iron it flat first. You can see that jog in the fabric there because of the bump in the fabric where I didn't iron it. But again, this is just a very quick and dirty demonstration to show you what I'm talking about. Obviously this in the finished article will be stitched, but we put the seam gauge and butt the seam gauge right up against where the cord is. We are at 5/8 of an inch of a flange, so the amount of fabric you've got left over here is 5/8 of an inch, which is what we want because that's the seam allowance that we're dealing with on this pattern. I'm going to go and press my 105 centimeters of this fabric so I don't have any creases in it, and then I am going to draw on my 1.5 inch wide strips. As I mentioned, you can totally do this with a rotary cutter and a cutting mat and ruler if that's your preference. I am not good with rotary cutters and rulers, so I'm going to cut mine out by hand. Something else that you could possibly do, especially if you have a standard size piece of fabric like this, is you do the continuous bias binding method, which I will link to in the description down below. There's different ways of folding and cutting this fabric to get your strips on the bias of the width that you need. There's multiple different ways of doing it. I'm going to do the way that's most natural for me, which might be one of the ways that takes the longest, but I do end up with accurate strips that way, which is what I want. Once you've cut all your strips of fabric, you'll need to sew them together, and you want to do it in the same manner that you would if you were making bias binding. So you want to sew all of your seams at a 45-degree angle, trim off the excess, and you will want to press all of those seams open once you've finished sewing the giant pile of strips that you've made together. I've got my regular zipper foot on my machine, and I've got my needle moved over as far as it will go to the left, and I have got my string or your cord or your wool or whatever you're using to stuff your piping. You want to have that in between the wrong sides of the piping, and we're going to be making sure that the raw edges of your bias cut strips match up, so like this, not like that. And then we're going to just sew along here as close as you possibly can to the string. So every now and again you just want to kind of make sure that the string is, or the cord or the piping or the macrame cord, whatever you're using, is as far over as possible, but the raw edges are matching up. I'm actually going to increase my stitch length to 3.5 because we are going to be stitching over this line of stitching again when we install the piping into the garment. But something that we will need to do is unpick some of our stitching to finish off the ends of pieces that need to meet neatly, and so a slightly larger stitch is slightly easier to unpick, but we don't want it so large that it either gathers or just unravels really easily. So I'm going up to a 3.5. I've got my needle as far over to the left as it can go. The edge of my presser foot is right up against the cording that I'm using in side of my piping, got wrong sides together, and I'm going to sew all of this, keeping the raw edges as even as possible the whole way down. This is bias, so you don't want to be putting any kind of, like, you don't want to be pulling on it because you could stretch the pieces out of alignment, and we want to keep this as uniform as possible. And the other thing that I've done is I have my giant pile of bias strips that I have sewn together in my lap. All of the seam allowances have been pressed open, and I've also got my string or cord or whatever you're going to use, I've got that in my lap as well. I personally don't like to pin this. It would take forever. It would kind of distort things, and I find it much easier to do this by hand. I'm going to go quite slow. It's not a race. I will get this done as accurately as possible rather than as quickly as possible. I'm going to set you up on the tripod and just over to the left so you can see what I mean when I say accuracy over speed, and fingers crossed we will end up with more than enough piping for the dress. I'm pretty sure that we're going to. As I mentioned, there are lots of different stuffings that you can use for your piping, and you can do flat piping as well. I do find flat piping slightly trickier to work with because there isn't that core of something for your presser foot to rest up against, especially when you're going around corners, but it is totally doable and it does look really lovely. So that's how I make my piping. Obviously you can buy ready-made piping, and if you can find the exact colour and fabric texture that you are after for your project, awesome. If not, making your own does give you a huge amount of flexibility in, as I say, the fabric colour and texture that you are going to go for. I have seen a lot of velvet or velveteen piping which looks absolutely gorgeous. Something you do want to bear in mind is the thickness of your fabrics when you are picking one to make piping with. The thicker the piping, the more difficult it is going to be to go around corners and finish off neatly into seams. Not impossible, it's just something that you really want to think about. Personally, I've used cotton lawns, quilting cottons and viscoses, and I really like those fabrics for piping. If you have something specific in mind, it's definitely worth having a play around and seeing what outcomes you get from the different combination of the fabric and the core. It's definitely worth an experiment. It may work, it may not. I would definitely say make a test piece before you cut into all of your fabric, just in case. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.